Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome and thank you for coming to this wonderful museum this morning. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to introduce the two very important professional colleagues who are helping me today. First, I would like you to meet Carla Ball, who is my good friend and amazing computer assistant. Carla has been a major help in planning my talk, in integrating the digitized version of this over 110 or 120-year-old book, and putting the photographs into PowerPoint on my computer. Carla has been a huge help in facilitating my delivery of this talk, and she will advance the slides while I give the presentation. Her technical expertise has been absolutely crucial, and her general advice and enthusiastic support have been of great importance. And I would also like to introduce Mark Titus, who is one of the top videographers in Kansas City. I have known Mark for many years because he made the videos for the marvelous Park University classical music concerts at the 1900 building, which I attended regularly until the onset of COVID canceled them. I have asked Mark to create a video record of this talk, which I will present to Doran Cart for the archives of the museum, so that they will have an oral history of the great role played by Missouri Mules in World War I and the war effort. I would also like to introduce our hosts here at the museum, my dear friend Doran Cart, Senior Curator and Chief Archivist of the museum, Carrie Shoptaw, I don't know if she's in the room right.
She's always on the run.
She's on the run, who has been very helpful in facilitating everything. And Melody Johnson, manager of the cafe, who has worked with Ellen, our hostess today, for planning our luncheon. They've all been a great help, and I'm grateful for their enthusiasm and hospitality. I have provided 3 handouts for each of you, so be sure you have them. If you don't, I have some more. And the 3 handouts are, first, a small family tree showing the Guyton branch of our family. There is also a short outline of my talk describing how it is divided into 6 chapters. And the third handout is a copy of the lyrics to the song Over There, Over There, which was popular in the United States at the outbreak of World War I. So I think we're ready to begin. When I was deciding about what would be my first presentation for the group, my mind and heart were drawn immediately to the story I'm going to tell you today. I am pleased to be able to give my talk here at this amazing World War I museum, because as you will plainly see, coming to this important and magnificent place sets the scene for my story as no other place possibly could. My presentation is based largely on the photos and text in this book. We have 2 copies of the book. Doran is holding up the original one with the leather binding, and there's a second one which does not have the leather binding, which I have. In addition to the Guyton and Harrington book, I did research in a book on the Guyton family genealogy, in a book which I got through Amazon. And this original Guyton and Harrington mule book is at least 110 years old, probably older. Only 2 copies of it are known to exist. The one with the leather binding, which my mother and I gave to the museum about 20 years ago, and which has the original leather binding. And the last copy with no leather binding, which I have kept for our family. I asked Doran to please bring the one with the leather cover so you could see that. Now the slide.
She asked you to do something.
You better do it.
You better do it.
So Carla is going to advance the slides. I wanted to mention that the slides do not mesh perfectly with the text, but you will see that they are arranged so that they will dovetail with the thoughts I'm delivering. In most instances, the photos will be self-explanatory, and I have synchronized them as best I can with the text. So I do not intend to comment on each slide, only in a few instances. So chapter 1, the photo here, well, that's the cover of the book. The next photo shows my great-grandfather on the left and his partner, W.R. Harrington. My great-grandfather, they were the founders of Guyton and Harrington Mule Farms. So my presentation today is not a story about war. It is, however, a story largely occasioned by war. It tells of the decades of exhausting work invested by my great-grandfather, J.D. Guyton, seen on the left, and his partner and first cousin, William Roscoe Harrington, who raised what are widely acknowledged to have been among the finest mules in the world at a time when they were desperately needed. First, domestically, to rebuild our own country after the Civil War, and for the westward development by pioneers, and later for use in huge, truly vast numbers by the English Army to fight 3 separate wars, to wit, the 2 Boer Wars in South Africa and World War I in Europe. In this second photograph, on the left is my Uncle Frank, great Uncle Frank. In this huge effort, J.D. and his partner, W.R. Harrington, were assisted by John Frank Guyton, who was my great uncle and the brother of my grandmother, whose name was Fannie Mae Guyton Carkener. I have provided for each of you a little family tree which Carla created to show you the Guyton family. You can see on the chart that my grandmother, Fannie Mae Guyton, was the daughter of J.D. Guyton. She married George Stewart Carkener after his first wife, Nell, died, and their only child was my father, George Guyton Carkener, who was always called Guyton. To understand the great success of this vast enterprise, we need to remember that it was literally on the backs of massive numbers of Missouri mules that England fought those 3 wars. Before those wars, though, early in its history, Guyton and Harrington sold tens of thousands of mules to miners and pioneers who were heading west. Mules played a very significant role during a large part of the pioneer days and the settlement of the western United States. As you may know, the trailhead of the Santa Fe Trail was at that time in Independence, Missouri, not too far from Lathrop, and many settlers bought huge numbers of strong mules from the young firm of Guyton and Harrington to pull their covered wagons on the great journey westward. So I am happy to tell you this morning what is to me the utterly astonishing history of the Guyton and Harrington mule farms, which provided a tremendous number of working animals, mostly mules, but also many tens of thousands of horses, fine saddle horses for the cavalry of the British Army to fight the 3 wars in succession, which I've mentioned, the 2 Boer Wars and World War I. The coordination of many complex aspects of this business to make it all work smoothly, and to do that before the days of any even remotely modern farm equipment or telephones or trucks, not to mention adding machines or computers or email, is truly awe-inspiring to me. As little girls and all through our growing up years, my 2 sisters and I heard the endless stories about memories of our elders and on my father's side of the family about this story, which I'm about to describe today. When we 3 sisters were young, in the late 1940s and 1950s, our family frequently, usually once a month, drove on Sundays to have a day in Lathrop and enjoy our great Uncle Frank's and Aunt Mary's farm, which Uncle Frank had retained as a small acreage, really just a remnant of the large property they held, which Uncle Frank had retained after the close of the massive mule business. He always had ponies or a horse for us to ride, so we loved our days in Lathrop. Now, there is a terribly tragic story which does not concern the mules, but about which I need to inform you because we are here at the World War I Memorial. It concerns the fact that my grandfather, George Stewart Carkener, and his first wife, Nell, who died at a very young age, had a son named Stewart Carkener, who was 10 years older than my father, Guyton, who was Stewart's half-brother. Stewart was a bright and promising student at Princeton when World War I broke out. And against the frantic pleading of his father and many others, he was absolutely bound and determined to join the war effort. You may recall that here in America, there was a lot of gung-ho enthusiasm about World War I, with people singing songs like, "Over there, over there." Many young American men were tragically seduced by that song into wanting to fight in that war, and some did so. I have given you each a copy of the lyrics to that song. Despite every plea, Stewart left Princeton and enlisted in the Canadian Army in 1914. He joined the Canadian forces because the United States did not enter World War I until 1916. And they would have not taken Stewart anyway, because he was only 17 years old. But the Canadian Army did enlist him. An awful catastrophe ensued, and Stewart was killed in France on the dreadful battlefields at Verdun. My sisters and I were always told that our grandfather never, ever got over that loss, and that he, my grandfather, George Stewart Carkener, spent the rest of his life working with 5 other Kansas City fathers whose sons had also died in World War I to found and build the original World War I Memorial here on this site where we are today. Thus, you can see that our family is closely connected to this museum by both the awful loss of Stewart in France and the hundreds of thousands of mules which, as I will now explain, were sent to Europe from Lathrop, Missouri, to fight that war. Shortly before her passing, about 20 years ago, my dear mother, Laura Kemper Toll Carkener, made a very generous bequest to this museum during its reconstruction. I was with her during those times, and we had several meetings with Doran, who asked Mother how she would like to memorialize her gift. She suggested a very small plaque, which you can see on the wall at the entrance of the main display hall, commemorating her contribution, which was made in honor of 3 men. She asked that the plaque would read, "In memory of Stewart Carkener, who died at Verdun, and of George Stewart Carkener, the father of Stewart Carkener, who was the founder of this museum, and of George Guyton Carkener, my father, who served in the Army Air Corps during World War II and was a lifelong and devoted supporter of this museum." It was at that time, when Mother made her bequest, that I first met Doran Cart, the brilliant chief archivist and senior curator here, who is, in my view, the very heart and soul of this museum. Doran has worked tirelessly for many decades to track down and obtain artifacts from the war of all kinds which were needed for display here. I have personal knowledge that Doran is the ultimate authority behind the creation of this magnificent museum and has been the driving force in creating and maintaining the incredible collection at the museum. I personally revere Doran and his many years of service to the museum and to our city. So I am genuinely honored to have Doran here with us today. I have just learned that he will be retiring soon, and I am grateful to have this opportunity to thank him for his enormous life work of creating this stunning museum. So today, we will examine together the almost mind-boggling story of the Guyton and Harrington Mule Company in Lathrop, Missouri, and describe how it provided 350,000 mules and 90,000 horses to the British Army to fight World War I in Europe, and before that, 180,000 mules and 170,000 horses to the British for the two Boer Wars in South Africa, which dated from 1890 to 1902. I have learned from many articles which I found online that Guyton and Harrington provided about half of all the mules shipped from the United States to Europe for World War I. There were certainly other suppliers of mules in the United States, but I have not been able to find any reference by name to any of them in my research. This enormous feat was managed from their main offices on just under 5,000 acres near Lathrop, Missouri, which is a small town about 35 miles northwest of Kansas City. Although as far as I know, this story has never been told to the public, it was written up and photographed in this book, which was published by Guyton and Harrington during their years of operation over 110 years ago. The book is not only a photo history of the mule business, but I have learned that many copies of this book were likely printed so that copies could be circulated throughout the country, especially in the farming states, and the books were used as an early form of advertising during their years of peak activity. It is important to understand that prior to World War I, Guyton and Harrington had provided the English cavalry with horses and mules to fight the two Boer Wars in South Africa, and that is largely why they were so well prepared to raise and ship such large numbers of mules for World War I. So now returning for a moment to the initial creation of the firm of Guyton and Harrington Mule Farms, the company actually began some years after the United States Civil War, which dated from 1861 to 1865. I hardly need to remind you that our entire country was torn apart in every way, but most damaged, disabled, and struggling to recover were the southern states. Virtually every animal in the South had been killed for food. There were virtually no horses, oxen, mules, or donkeys to plow fields, or pull any carts to market, or for transportation. Even horses and oxen had been slaughtered and eaten, along with all of the chickens, sheep, and pigs to sustain the starving residents of the southern states and the many thousands of soldiers in the armies of both the North and the South on both sides of the Civil War, causing terrible shortages throughout the South. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, draft animals, mainly horses and mules, to plow fields and haul wagons of produce were desperately needed for the recovery of the war-damaged farms and fields in the South and to restore commerce. Realizing this awful disaster in the South, one young man had an idea. His name was J.D. Guyton. He was a farm boy who had somehow learned about mules and could see that what the South needed was draft animals, horses, mules, oxen, donkeys, anything that could pull a plow or a wagon. This young man, John D. Guyton, who is always called J.D., was born in 1853 in Pickens, Alabama. He migrated with his parents north up the Mississippi River from Alabama to St. Louis, and later westward to the Kansas City area. He reasoned that mules were desperately needed to rebuild the southern states. He also realized that if he could buy some mules in the north, he could probably sell them for a profit in the war-torn South, as defined by the Mason-Dixon line. Parenthetically, I recently learned that Mason and Dixon were the last names of the two surveyors who marked out the state lines which came to define the divide between the North and the South, hence the name Mason-Dixon Line. Only a few years after the end of the Civil War, possibly in his late teens, J.D. started his small business by buying at first just 1 or 2 mules in the North, selling them at a profit in the South, then retracing his steps, doing it again and again and again. When J.D. began his career, he literally walked, or maybe sometimes rode a mule, leading other mules, or sometimes a horse, to take them into the South. Eventually, as the business grew, he hired and carefully trained other men about how to evaluate the best mules. And they too, as employees of J.D., began to travel to the North, buy only the best mules, which were then ridden or walked back to the South, where they were sold. Any employees who brought back inferior mules that were not up to J.D.'s standards were either retrained or let go. In the early years, walking along the dirt roads leading his mules, he often slept out of doors or was occasionally given a meal and some lodging in a house along the road. Over time, he made some friends along the travel route. It was in this way that he met his wife. He was often welcomed on these walking trips into the home of a kind family with the last name Prude, P-R-U-D-E. Their house became a regular stopping place for him, and it is there he met his future wife, Margaret Alice Prude. Because of his surprising success with this simple beginning, he eventually expanded into a fixed location where he joined with his first cousin, William Roscoe Harrington, who was born in 1860, also in Pickens, Alabama. W.R. Harrington's mother's maiden name was Guyton. He was 7 years younger than J.D. They worked as a powerful partnership over many decades, and together they created the very successful firm of Guyton and Harrington Mule Farms beginning in the late 1890s. So, powerful draft animals, primarily mules but also fine horses, became the mainstay of rebuilding the war-ravaged South, as well as of contributing greatly to the development of the whole United States before the spread of motorized farm equipment and eventually tractors, cars, and trucks. Guyton and Harrington soon decided to breed mules for sale in addition to continuing to buy mules for resale, and they selected the rich farming area around the town of Lathrop, Missouri, for their headquarters. They could see that the market for thousands of mules was going to grow, and breeding was the best way to have a sufficient inventory of high-quality mules. Gradually, they purchased a total of just under 5,000 acres of beautiful rolling pastures with ample streams, lakes, and springs near Lathrop. In the beginning, Guyton and Harrington began by selling their own mules, which they bred, and also some which they purchased, but mostly just to farmers and pioneers. But eventually they came to the attention of the English army, who would need immense numbers of mules for the 3 separate wars I've already mentioned. Now, before going any further with the history of the Guyton and Harrington Mule Company, and now that I have set the historical scene that created the massive demand for these animals, I would like to turn my attention to the focus of my presentation today, which is describing what exactly is a mule, and to describe the many powerful traits of the mules themselves, which made them of such enormous benefit to these 3 war efforts. So I come now to the 2 important questions for today, which were on the invitation. What exactly is a mule, and how could you get one? The most important thing for you to know is that a mule is a hybrid animal, which is to say that it is the offspring of the interbreeding between 2 equine species, a female horse, which we all know is called a mare, and a male stallion of the ass family, which few people know is called a jack or a jackass. The family of asses just from cute little burros through donkeys and up to very big, sometimes very mean male stallion asses, which are called jacks. Whereas we all know that an intact male horse is called a stallion, few people know that stallions of the ass family are called correctly jackasses, and they are equivalent to a stallion horse. Jacks are notorious for being very mean, difficult to manage, and quite aggressive. The term jackass to describe an unpleasant, mean, or aggressive man most certainly derives from this animal name. Interbreeding of different species is not uncommon in nature, and because horses and asses are so similar, some interbreeding occurred in the wild. One of the most important things to remember about all hybrid animals is that they are sterile and cannot reproduce. Mules do come, they are born, in two sexes. The males are called mules, and the females are either called mollies or sometimes jennies. In normal parlance, few people know or knew the terms molly or jenny for female mules, and they are generally just all called mules. However, a male mule, if it were not gelded, which means castrated, it would try to mate with a mare or a molly, and even if it did, no offspring could occur. The reason why these hybrids, the mules and jennies, cannot breed and reproduce is because they do not have an even number of chromosomes. As already described, mules are a hybrid of two species, the female horse and the male donkey or ass. And so the hybrids end up with an odd number of chromosomes. For example, a horse has 64 chromosomes, and an ass or donkey has 62 chromosomes. But a mule inherits 63 chromosomes, which cannot divide into pairs. And an even number of chromosomes is needed to be able to divide into pairs and reproduce. So the hybrids are sterile. It is this chromosome anomaly that makes it impossible for the hybrids to produce offspring. Therefore, since mules do not develop full reproductive capacity, the only way to obtain a vast number of mules is to have a very large herd of brood mares, horses, and a large number of the finest jacks, male asses, they could find to breed to the mares. And that is exactly what Guyton and Harrington had. Mules are most recognizable by their huge ears, which are very dramatically larger than horses' ears. There are many other traits that distinguish horses from mules, but the very big ears are the most obvious and commonly known trait. When I found this photograph of a newborn mule foal online, I just fell in love with it. It clearly shows that its mother would have been an Appaloosa mare. And just look at those big ears. Giant ears. This little animal is so dear and demonstrates the blending of the jack and the mare so vividly. I knew you would appreciate this sweet picture as much as I do. So to answer the question, it would be all but impossible for you or me to get a mule today. We would need a jack and a mare, and it would be extremely hard indeed to find a jack. I have discovered, using Google, that there are a few widely scattered hobbyists, mostly in the western United States, who do breed a few mules for pleasure, and they ride them. So to find a mule today, we would need to travel west to find people who are raising a small number of mules and try to buy one. Suffice it to say, it would be very difficult for you or me to get a mule today. Just as male calves are castrated to become steers, and male colts, horses, are castrated or gelded when they are very young to make them more docile and manageable. All of the male mules were also gelded just to keep them calmer and from having any interest in breeding. However, remember, even if they did breed, no offspring would result for the reasons just explained. Having 63 chromosomes, they cannot divide by 2, so no pregnancy would occur. At the very beginning, Guyton and Harrington purchased 11 prized jacks to sire the new mules, and eventually many thousands of excellent broodmares were bought to become their mothers. Over time, many other jacks and mares were purchased as the business grew. In addition to the breeding program, Guyton and Harrington still purchased top quality mules for resale to the British when they could find them. You might wonder, as I did, what would happen if you bred an ass and a horse the other way, where the mother would be a female ass or a large female donkey, and the father would be a stallion horse. And this mating would have also occurred in the wild. However, that pairing results in a hybrid called a hinny, Hinny, which does not have the strength or the sure-footedness or the intelligence or any of the useful traits of mules or even horses. Therefore, lacking any useful traits whatsoever, hinnies have no value and as work animals, so they were never bred intentionally by mankind. As you may be realizing, it required a very large number of people to run the operations of Guyton and Harrington. As described earlier, the enterprise grew rapidly, and the Guyton and Harrington Mule Company gradually bought up to 4,800 acres of prime pasture lands surrounding the small town of Lathrop, Missouri, as well as significant complexes near the rail centers of Kansas City. The land near Lathrop had rich green pastures, rolling fields, ample fresh water streams, springs, and lakes. As the demand rose and more mules were needed over time, as many as 500 carpenters were hired in different locations to build and maintain corrals, chutes, and miles of fencing. Carpenters built the interior stalls inside massive brick barns, and they built outdoor pens and wooden feeding troughs throughout the Lathrop complex. And at each of the transit stations along the rail line between Lathrop and Port Chalmette, which is in New Orleans, which I will describe shortly. The construction and maintenance of the infrastructure of large brick barns, which had wooden stalls inside of them, and many wooden corrals, wooden feeding troughs, and watering locations, fences and gates, required large crews of builders and maintenance men. The narrow wooden chutes down which the mules passed single file when being loaded onto or off of trains or ships had to be built and maintained by carpenters. One source I found online stated that in the early 1900s, Guyton and Harrington opened 3 huge mule barns in the Lathrop area. Each barn covered 65,000 square feet, and each could hold up to 1,000 mules at a time. Also, at its height, the company hired as many as 300 veterinarians who were employed in all the operations in Lathrop, as well as at the stations along the rail lines from Lathrop to Port Chalmette in New Orleans, where the mules were loaded onto the steamer ships. A very large hospital barn can be seen in one of the photographs at Lathrop, which would have required a large number of veterinarians. There was a constant need for veterinarians to evaluate the health and periodic injuries that occurred to some animals and to treat any injured mules. Veterinarians also attended some births of mule foals. They performed gelding as well as inspection of animals for shipment, and they oversaw the breeding of the jacks to the mares. Also, as many as 300 blacksmiths, sometimes called farriers, were also needed to shoe the mules and the horses, not only in Lathrop, but all along the train route to New Orleans. Brick was used for the main structure of the barns because of the horrific danger of fire that there would be in a huge all-wood barn. I remember stories told to us by our Uncle Frank about the total panic he witnessed by both the animals and the men during a huge fire which he experienced once in a wood barn near Lathrop. It was a horrible story. The mules were so terrified that the men could sometimes not even lead them or herd them out of the fire. For years, in Ripley's Believe It or Not, one of the questions was, what is the largest area of land on Earth covered by a roof? The answer was one of the largest barns on the property of Guyton and Harrington Mule Farms in Lathrop, Missouri. All of this ancillary construction required additional crews of workmen who were needed to be on hand to make constant ongoing repairs over many years. And now I come to one of my favorite groups in this paper, the Chigo Boys. Herding these thousands and thousands of animals required the work of a unique group of wranglers who were called the Chigo Boys. During my work on this paper, I have come to be very fond of and to have great respect for the Chigo Boys and to appreciate the enormity of the job they did managing these giant herds of mules. The word Chigo, spelled C-H-I-G-O-E, is Spanish, and it means an insect, a Chigo flea, which is sort of like what we call a chigger, and also kind of like a flea. Probably our word for the insect called chigger flows from that Spanish word. The term Chigo Boys was used for these wranglers because they moved around on horseback so quickly and made fast stops and starts and quick turns in herding the mules, and they brought to mind the quick hopping of a Chigo flea. It appears from the photographs that the Chigo Boys were a mixed group of Mexican and Negro horsemen. They were excellent riders and could round up, separate, and herd the mules from one place to another with great skill. This amazing photograph, taken with a wide-angle lens, shows approximately 40 horsemen lined up for a photo op. I counted them. I didn't know that wide-angle lenses dated so far back, but this picture must have been taken about 1915. The photos I have of the Chigo Boys are taken in Lathrop, but there were some of them required at each of the transit stations along the train route to move the animals onto and off of the trains and into holding pens for food and water, and then back onto the train for the next day's journey. It appears that the Chigo Boys were riding very high-quality horses, and they were a crucial part of this organization. In addition to the carpenters, veterinarians, blacksmiths, and Chigo Boys, this book and other sources refer to approximately 150 additional men who were required to clean stalls, keep the feed troughs full, keep the water supplies sufficient, as well as keeping the buildings clean, delivering hay and grain to the barns, and more. According to one source found through Google, the Lathrop property alone, at its peak, had 18 buildings and could handle up to 50,000 mules on site at one time. Chapter 3, a brief review of mules in history. The animal family called asses is known to have existed in earliest human prehistory, roaming the plains of Anatolia in what is modern-day Turkey, as did horses. Mules occurred naturally when jacks bred with horse mares, and mules were recognized and recorded in the very earliest history of mankind. Mules are known to have been bred and used in Egypt before 3000 BC, and are mentioned in Homer's writings in 800 BC. And mules were recorded in texts from the Hittites, the Sumerians, and from ancient Greece and Ethiopia. Around the world, groups of very early mankind, learned to appreciate the unusual qualities of these naturally occurring hybrids, which we call mules, and they apparently began deliberately breeding them and placing a very high value on mules. Mules are mentioned in writings from the Renaissance in Europe. Marco Polo in 1294 praised mules. Mules became a flourishing industry in Spain, Italy, and France in the 18th century. The Marquis de Lafayette knew about and greatly appreciated mules. George Washington played a major role in the development of the mule. King Charles of Spain sent George Washington a gift of a 4-year-old Spanish jack, appropriately named Royal Gift, who is credited with siring the development of the entire family of the American mule. In less than 15 years, George Washington had 58 mules at Mount Vernon. Chapter 4, the British Remount Commission. I come now to a discussion of the British Remount Commission, which was the arm of the English Army who were stationed in Lathrop and Kansas City and were charged with examining and purchasing the best mules and horses then available for shipment first to the two Boer Wars, later to the war front in Europe during World War I, beginning in 1914. The English also purchased top-quality saddle horses from Guyton and Harrington for their mounted cavalry and most of the officers. Guyton and Harrington bred tens of thousands of very fine horses, but they were best known for their very high quality and the enormous numbers of their mules. So 12 years after the end of the Boer Wars, when World War I broke out, the British already had a strong relationship with Guyton and Harrington, and they turned to them again for the even larger number of mules they needed to fight in Europe. The English government sent their finest, most important remount officers to Lathrop to purchase livestock for their cavalry and for pulling all of the equipment needed for war. Experts in horses and pack animals, they were charged with buying a constant supply of the best animals they could find for use in the British Army. The Remount Commission had moved a sizable number of British officers and some of their wives to Kansas City and the area surrounding, and at the time of the Boer Wars, which began in 1901. Most of the Remount Commission actually lived at the Mulebach Hotel, but a few were provided housing, pictured here, on the grounds of the Guyton and Harrington ranches, so that they were on site and they were readily available to inspect and buy mules on a daily basis. The British officer who was one of the very top leaders of the English Army's Remount Commission for the longest time was Colonel Francis B. Drage. Colonel Drage was a veteran of the Boer Wars, and he was a constant presence in Lathrop, where he led the British purchasing team for many years in the selection and purchase of mules for England's war effort in World War I. Colonel Drage was one of the most important British officers who ever dealt with Guyton and Harrington. He and a good number of English Army officers who served under him also lived in the Kansas City area or in Lathrop during those years. If the name Drage rings a bell to you, it is because Kansas Cityan and Barstow alumna Lucy Christie married Colonel Francis B. Drage in 1901. During the time that Colonel Drage was stationed in Lathrop, he met his wife, Lucy Christie Drage, a Kansas Cityan whose name may be familiar to many of you because she played an influential role in Kansas City society. I am told that she founded the 81 Club and promoted the custom of serving high tea, which she adopted from her husband's background. She was apparently a decorator and was influential in the early years of the Kansas City Country Club. Using Google, I was able to find Lucy Drage's obituary, and I discovered the following information. This is a quote from the obituary. When the Century Ball was held on December 31st, 1900, in Convention Hall, Lucy was there. She was widely acclaimed as the belle of the ball. Around that time, she met Francis B. Drage, an Englishman. He was a member of the British Army and a veteran of the Boer War. Quote from Lucy, "I had some English friends on Warwick Boulevard, and I met him through them," close quote. She told the Kansas City Star decades later. Lucy married Francis on November 12, 1901. End quote from the newspaper. So whereas I think many of you know about and have heard a lot about Lucy Drage, I doubt that you would have known why her British husband was in the Kansas City area in the first place. At the end of his work at Guyton and Harrington for the British Remount Commission, Colonel Drage retired from the English Army and became a citizen of the United States and of Kansas City. Colonel and Mrs. Drage, as well as other top British officers, were provided housing by Guyton and Harrington on the grounds of the Lathrop property. But many of the Englishmen also lived much of the time at the Mulebach Hotel in Kansas City. I have no information from my research about it, but I rather doubt that Lucy would have cared to spend very much time in Lathrop. I'm going to make just a very short digression here. I just cannot resist sharing a serendipitous current remembrance of the Drage family, which Carla brought to me recently. Just a few weeks ago, Carla Ball, whom I have introduced to you earlier, and who has been working with me on this presentation for some time, arrived at my home for our meeting and told me that she had found an interesting current fact connecting Lucy Drage and her husband, Colonel Drage, in a wonderful art collection currently on exhibit at the Nelson Atkins Museum called American Art Deco, Designing for the People, 1916 to 1939. A very beautiful evening gown worn by the Drage's daughter, Betty Drage, to the opening ball of the Nelson Atkins Museum was part of that Art Deco show. Betty's wonderful gown is an icon of the styles of that period. Carla took a photograph of the dress, and I thought the coincidence of finding Betty Drage's evening gown while we were writing about Colonel and Mrs. Drage was just such great fun, and I decided to include it here to share with all of you. Chapter 5, Shipment of the Mules by rail from Lathrop to Port Chalmette, New Orleans. Carla and I created this map showing the 4 stations along the train route from Lathrop to New Orleans, at which the mules were taken off the trains every evening. A very important benefit to the location of Lathrop was that it was a stop on the new southern spur of what was called the Hamilton-St. Joseph Railroad, a part of the Santa Fe rail line. This railhead made Lathrop an ideal location for shipping mules by train to New Orleans, where they were put on steamships to go to Europe. The rail lines were also crucial for bringing into Lathrop prodigious amounts of hay and grain as feed. Some hay and grain were raised locally, but not nearly enough for these huge numbers of animals, and the Santa Fe Railroad helped to meet this need. Great care was taken of the hundreds of thousands of mules which left Lathrop by rail. During shipment from Lathrop to Port Chalmette, the mules were taken off the trains to be watered, fed, and inspected every night. What were called stations were constructed at one-day rail intervals between Lathrop and New Orleans. The stations were very large complexes of barns, chutes, and paddocks when they required teams of men to manage the animals. Every night, the mules were unloaded from the trains, watered, fed, allowed to exercise or move around just a bit. A full infrastructure and some of the veterinarians, carpenters, Chigo boys, and large crews of other workmen were needed along the train route to handle supplying hay, grain, and water, and to do constant health inspections as well as cleaning of the corrals and paddocks and herding the animals onto and off of the rail cars. Any mules or horses which were injured during shipment were taken for treatment and recovery, if possible, to a local hospital barn built at each station. The logistics of loading and unloading so many animals required a fine-tuned labor force at each station, along the route and at Port Chalmette, where the animals were loaded onto the transatlantic ships. A team of Chigo boys was needed at each station to manage the herds. It is important for me to point out that even after these vast numbers of mules were purchased at auction in Lathrop by the English government from Guyton and Harrington, and the mules were, from that time, actually owned by the English, nevertheless, under the contract, Guyton and Harrington was still responsible for transporting them to New Orleans, and therefore the company constructed and staffed these very large infrastructures along the trail route at their expense. They needed to have a sufficient labor force at each station to herd the animals onto and off of the boxcars, to water and feed them, to let them walk about in corrals, and to reload them onto the trains. The logistics of moving these large herds of animals for such a long distance by rail would be difficult today, even with all our computer age and cell phone equipment. So imagine the arduous task it was back then. The train from Lathrop stopped first in Kansas City, then on to East St. Louis and Nashville and Columbia, Tennessee, and ended in Port Chalmette. You can see the enormity of the operation at Port Chalmette from this drawing, which shows 16 barns. Let's see, well, this is the ship they were getting on. 16 barns, a large pasture. This is the property in Port Chalmette. A large pasture, corral area, and a large wharf where the mules were loaded onto the ships. And then there's a closer view of some of the feed stables. This slide is called The Last Count. This photograph is the last one in the book, and it feels very melancholy and sad. There's something plaintive and even tragic about this picture in the book. Those men have written down, carefully double-checked the number of animals which have passed through the gate, and they have tallied the last mules or horses to be loaded onto a steamship. The slide signals the end of the responsibility by Guyton and Harrington for these animals, and the mules are now given over to the British Army and to their fate. Such enormous effort over many years and so much energy went into producing, caring for, and transporting these hordes of very fit and fine animals, and they passed through this gate to spend weeks in the dark hold of a ship at sea, and then to face the terrors of the battlefields from which only a scant few probably survived. Chapter 6. Now, in conclusion, I would like to offer just a few final thoughts about the nature of mules and their importance throughout history. Over the ages, mankind came to recognize the outstanding benefits that mules offered as working animals for farming, transportation, and hauling extremely heavy loads. Mules are generally stronger and more sure-footed than horses. Their hooves are shaped quite differently from horses' hooves. Mules' hooves are much harder and more durable. Mules are much stronger than horses, and mules can live and work for up to 50 years, whereas a horse is considered old at 20 years. You may have heard the expression, stubborn as a mule. So we may wonder, are mules stubborn? A mule gets its athletic ability from the horse, and its intelligent from the ass or donkey family. Donkeys and mules have been labeled stubborn for centuries. but maybe it is really only an abundance of common sense and a strong desire for self-preservation that might make them inclined to resist some commands, and therefore appear to be stubborn. When urged by a rider to walk into a wide stream of flowing water, a horse will usually just walk into the stream and cross over. But a mule may balk and refuse, and thereby appear stubborn. However, some have argued that the mule may refuse, possibly because it cannot see how deep the water is, and therefore might fear that it would fall into a hole under the water. So he or she is afraid and balks, and this is then called stubborn. If a man or some other animal walks through the stream safely in front of the mule, then the mule will calmly follow. This begs the question, is the mule just arbitrary and stubborn, or is there some element of intelligence or self-concern at play? Well, we can never know what a mule is thinking, of course, so the answer to that question is a matter of opinion or conjecture. But many people over many centuries came to respect mules and appreciate their instincts. Mules tended to be of a calmer nature than horses and were less likely to bolt at the sound of guns or cannons than horses will do. Mules recover their strength much faster than horses do after a hard workout. Mules are very powerful animals, and in large teams, they hauled extremely heavy wagons. There were times when an empty wagon might weigh up to 2,000 pounds and then be loaded with 3,000 pounds of cargo, resulting in a total weight of 5,000 pounds to be hauled. And that required teams of the strongest animals available, which were mules. 20 Mule Team Borax was the ultimate show of strength by mules. Borax is an element which was used as a bleach. It is one of the heaviest elements that occur naturally. In the early days, borax was mined in Southern California and was hauled up from the area of Death Valley, which is below sea level and is in a very hot climate. And there was by teams of 10 pairs of mules, which is to say 20 mules, harnessed and driven together to pull those heavy wagons. Hence the name 20 Mule Team Borax. I don't know about you, but I can clearly remember as a child seeing boxes of 20 Mule Team Borax for sale in grocery stores with the photo of the very long mule team on the box. Can you imagine handling the reins for 20 mules and driving such a long team of animals? It required great skill to drive a huge mule team of that size. I think I remember learning at some time that it required 2 men to drive the 20 mule teams. Each man had the reins for 10 mules. Horses, even Clydesdales, could not begin to equal that kind of strength and durability in the stressful heat and harsh conditions of Death Valley over long periods of time and in adverse weather, and still also have the stamina and recuperative power of mules. Additionally, mules can be saddled and ridden. The females, mollies, made better saddle animals than the male mules, but both can be ridden. The British cavalry preferred to ride mollies over mules because they were gentler, very strong and durable, and also more comfortable to ride. Mules could also be loaded with packs of supplies weighing up to 250 pounds, each to haul over an astounding 60 miles in a day in a long single file called a mule train. As noted earlier, mules played a key role in the westward expansion of our country, pulling covered wagons and carrying very heavy pack loads. Mules were very effective in mining, where they were harnessed to heavy ore wagons on rails which they pulled up from underground mines. Mules could tolerate and endure the terrible conditions at the war front better than horses could, and their stamina was generally greater than that of horses. After the end of World War I Animals were no longer used in any significant numbers in any future wars, and mules gradually ceased to be bred in large numbers. After World War I, and with the rapid development of cars and trucks, the huge Guyton and Harrington mule business ended rather abruptly. The firm's vast acres of prime farmland around Lathrop were gradually sold off, and the huge brick barns and other buildings eventually began to collapse and were carefully taken down to avoid becoming hazards in the community. Similarly, the stations along the train route were also dismantled. Although the mules are no longer part of our world, I would like to leave you with the thought that we do well to remember that these often ignored but truly amazing animals played a huge role in the very fabric of our history, both here and abroad, and that the state of Missouri produced a huge number of them. In 1993, the mule was named the state animal of Missouri. Years ago, the World War I Museum commissioned an artist to create a life-size team of 4 mules pulling a gun case on, which is on display. If time permits, I hope you will browse through the collection downstairs to see them. I must say in closing that I have absolutely loved researching and preparing this report, and I hope you have enjoyed hearing it as much as I've enjoyed working on it. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention. And thank you. Happy to take any questions if anybody has a question.
You have set a very high standard for me.
Seriously, how long does it take for a mule to reach maturity before it can be shipped?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say 2 to 3 years. And the gestation period is a year.
Wow.
So it was a long-term project. Yes?
Is a donkey part of the mule family?
A donkey is part of the ass family. So a mule is a hybrid of the horse and the ass. A burro or a donkey, those are strictly asses. And a horse is strictly a horse. So you get a mule when you have the horse and the ass combined. But donkeys and burros are asses.
So, Marley, when you were showing the map of the railroad going from Lathrop to St. Louis to Nashville and down to New Orleans, I was noticing that it's about the same distance from Nashville over to the East Coast. So, does anybody know why New Orleans was the place? Because they then had to go all the way around the.
That's an excellent question, and I really don't know.
I just wonder if.
I don't know. Maybe. Pardon? Mary Jo, did you have a question? No.
I hope you're going to publish it. It's video. It would be available.
Dodie, did you have a question?
It's a dumb question, you probably answered it, but how does a jackass, who's its mother, how does it stay a jackass? Do people breed, because you need a jackass to breed with
That's right.
a mare,
Yes.
a horse?
Yes.
And how does a jackass stay a jackass? I know.
Well, they are a specific species. They are.
I mean, who are their mothers?
I'm,
The female and the male are jackasses, right?
what?
Is it a Molly and a jackass?
No, the Molly. No. The Molly and the mule are the offspring of the jackass and the mare, and both the Molly and the mule are sterile because they have an odd number of chromosomes, so they can't make more mules. The only way you can get them is to go back and cross.
So what's
The-
a female jackass called? Since the male is called Jack, the female jack.
I don't know. There is a female ass. I don't know, frankly. That's something to look up. It's a good question. I don't know. It never crossed my mind. Any other questions? Well, thank you.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to my partner Ellen, who is our hostess today and has these beautiful flowers. When I walked in this morning, I was just thrilled and touched, and she had the placemats made from the photograph, and very much enjoyed working with Ellen. It's been a wonderful event for me. And thanks again to Carla, to Mark, thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're a love.
Do a little